Sounds right. Sounds right.
Welcome to the Indo-Pacific Dialogue, where today we're talking with Professor David Kinley about his latest book, The Liberty Paradox. David has an extraordinary background, born in Northern Ireland and a graduate of Cambridge University and the inaugural Chair of Human Rights Law at the University of Sydney. David is the founding member of the Australian Lawyer for Human Rights and an expert member of Doty Chambers in London. He's the author of Necessary Evil, How to Fix Finance by Saving Human Rights, and the co-author of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. In his latest book, The Liberty Paradox, David challenges us to rethink the concept of liberty in our modern world, instead arguing we need to balance individual freedoms with social responsibility. Join us as we explore what David's ideas about liberty and freedom means for policy, personal rights and societal duties. So David, thank you for joining us today and welcome. We're going to start with a simple question in terms of, in your book, you explore the intricate balance between freedom and responsibility. Could you share a personal experience or historical event that particularly influenced your views on this balance and perhaps what spurred you to or inspired you to write this book at this time?
Well, thank you very much, Hugh, for that introduction and for inviting me on. In many ways, it is a culmination of my professional and personal existence now that I've reached my sixth decade. As you mentioned, I was born in Northern Ireland and brought up there during the Troubles, the worst part of the terrorism and anti-terrorism in Ireland. And that, I dare say, influenced my view on what sorts of things are worth fighting for and what sorts of things are not worth fighting for. But then when I got into university and slowly but surely entered the field of human rights, in which I now almost solely occupy, I was always troubled by this notion of balancing freedom and equality, the two great pillars of human rights. How do you have people having absolute freedom on the one hand and absolute equality on the other? And of course, you cannot have either on their own and certainly not together. So how do they intersect? And the main way in which they intersect, or one of the main ways in which they intersect, is that freedom always has responsibilities attached to it. That said, what is peculiar about the subject of international human rights law and its meteoric rise since the Second World War is that, understandably, given that it grew out of the Second World War, it has emphasized freedom much more than responsibilities. And I'm not criticizing that. I think that was an entirely rational thing to do, given what had just happened in the first half of that century with two world wars and much else. So freedom therefore became a catch cry, became the word that would drive the human rights bandwagon. But it was never the case, particularly if you do read the international human rights legal instruments, it was never the case that freedom was absolute, was just simpliciter freedom with no conditions. Responsibilities are actually written in to the international legal instruments. And that means responsibilities not just of the state to honor your rights, but also of you and me in our interrelations with each other and with the state. The question then, of course, always becomes, where do you divide the freedom from the responsibilities and how do they interrelate in practice? In terms of sort of personal trigger moments that made me think, well, this is something that I should write about, I can't really honestly say that there was one, but I do say in the book that there was one in particular that made me reflect, perhaps just at that particular moment, an appropriate moment in my career, on how these two great themes of our life, responsibility and freedom, interact. And that was, of all things, at a conference for 100 human rights professors in China. in mainland China, and that was in itself interesting. And during the tea breaks, which in all conferences, but perhaps particularly conferences in China regarding human rights, most of the real work, most of the real conversations, most of the revelations occur. And I was there with one of my great friends and colleagues who I've known for many years in China, who is himself a very eminent human rights scholar in mainland China. And we were talking amongst us, him and others, about comparative constitutions that have human rights protections, of which China is an example. It has a very fulsome account of all economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights in its constitution. And he made the simple comment that, we have this right to freedom of expression and free elections, and free association. But there was a pause. He says it always comes at a cost. Now, that cost is, of course, a responsibility to the state, I think is what he principally meant, but also to each other. We then discussed further about the fact that that's the case in the West as well. I mean, we have rights, but they are subject to national security, public order, public health. So we sort of had an exchange of views despite different political arenas that drew on similar concepts about freedom and responsibility.
That's fascinating. I think, one of the points you made there is this great diversity throughout the world, throughout different states, in the architecture that each state has constructed. So for Australia, I think I'm right, has no human rights or a Bill of Rights, and there's nothing in the Constitution about human rights, in contrast to, say, China and other states where it's embedded. I think the state of Nepal, it's included in its constitution, clearly there. And we have other sort of mechanism, in the adoption of treaties, etc. But the way it's implemented in the states, also then this great diversity is then how it's implemented and how it's structured and interpreted based on the different, whether you're in an autocracy like China or a democracy like Australia. And I think a lot of people forget, if you look at the United States, a lot of people think as a great power, it's always just focusing on might is right. But if you look deep down, there is always a big push for the promotion of human rights in most of it, a lot of its activities. But I won't go down that route right now. But I think it's this diversity that you've identified is really interesting. And I think that's also, when you look at your text as well, is that you've covered so many different areas in terms of where this paradox exists in different spheres of life, in the pandemic, gun control, technology, the free speech. It sort of it touches on every aspect of someone's life, and so it is really important. And I think it's really important to what you've done is elevated this sort of to a conversation to discuss what these restrictions are on people's freedoms, that there is responsibility, and it seems to be that that's lost. This idea of responsibility has been lost, and I don't want to be generational about this, but also with the implementation of social media platforms, you see this great free speech, but the absence of a lot of responsibility. Would you like to sort of expand upon, like, for example, some of the areas that you see as most critical in terms of where responsibilities are perhaps lagging behind or discounted or need to be sort of emphasized in terms of the exercise of people's freedoms?
Yes, I think two things strike me about that overview of what I think the book is trying to convey are, firstly, that the paradox that I refer to is that it is within the word liberty itself, because prior, as I mentioned a moment ago, prior to the growth of international human rights law that we've seen today post Second World War, liberty was much more the preferred term in all sorts of documents. whether it was Declaration of Independence or Bills of Rights or political statements. And there, I think that was harking back to the Enlightenment notion of liberty, which has always been freedom comes with responsibilities. Whereas drawing out just the word freedom post Second World War was to emphasize, well, sometimes responsibilities can lead to the horrors, as we saw with the autocracies before, during, and after the Second World War. So that was the paradox that I'm trying to allude to, is the fact that we should reinvent, go back to the old ideas of liberty, and be sure that we understand that your freedom and my freedom depends on both of us recognizing responsibilities between each other. So that was the first thing. The second thing about the book in overview was that as I started to write it, I had, I suppose, I had two things on my shoulder, a devil and an angel, as it were. One saying, do the academic stuff, deep dive into the Enlightenment and all that led to in terms of our understanding of freedom and responsibility and how liberty grew. And the other was telling me, try and make it more accessible and intelligible to people who are not international human rights lawyers or philosophers. And I'm not sure which of those is the angel, which is the devil. But in the end, I went to the latter, and I pulled out what I thought at the time, I had only 3 or 4, but it grew into 10 altogether, 10 areas of our lives that are constantly challenging us. Things that we think about implicitly or explicitly on a daily basis. I thought it would be fun just to investigate, as well as I hope intellectually interesting for me and for the reader, investigate how we do well and how we do badly our balancing of freedom and responsibility, therefore the liberty paradox, in each of these areas. And that's what it turned out to be. It was a big education for me. I had to draw on areas and disciplines that are not mine: economics, psychology, philosophy, religion, technology. The list went on. But the areas I chose are perhaps then, well, not perhaps, they did reveal to me how extraordinarily pervasive is this balancing exercise that all of us are engaged in. Intellectuals or not, we're just doing it on a daily basis. Because the chapters that I chose, I just use one word for each of them, are health and happiness, work and wealth, security and voice, love and death, and then finally trust and respect. Now, all of these, if you think of them as to how they might present themselves in your daily lives, one realizes that nearly all of them are there on a sort of weekly basis at least, but and sometimes some more than others. And it's not hard when you've got 8,000 words or whatever for each of those enormous topics to find examples of where we've done it well, investigating our responsibilities and our freedoms in health, and where we've done it badly. And at the very time that I was writing the book, just as after I started it, COVID hit. In fact, I was really halfway through sort of its earliest drafts. And then, of course, that for 2.5 years, and one could say even today, it became a prism through which to look at this very issue of responsibilities and freedom, because clearly claims were being made of us to be responsible citizens, to wear masks, to not travel, to engage in a limited way with our fellow citizens. And yet those were clear invasions or crimping of our freedoms. And we all battled individually and as a community as to how and where those lines should be drawn. So it was the book is not only about COVID, of course, but it became this marvelous existing right in your face example of how we do balance these two great features of our existence.
Thank you, David. I think, and you raised COVID, and it is such a great case study that's fresh in everyone's minds, well documented, well recorded, and you can see the reactions, the diversity in the reactions of the state, versus the community in terms of how it should, how it can impose responsibilities on individuals' freedoms. And then even with Australia, you have the state of Victoria, which I think, I probably need to be verified this again, did have the longest lockdown in the world and one of the strictest, with its steel ring around the city of Melbourne, and you couldn't even get to, I actually experienced this myself. I couldn't return to the state once they unlocked Melbourne. I couldn't return to New South Wales because New South Wales was locked. And so you see this great variation in how states react, and you have and a great contrast in the United States of America with former President Trump and his actions or inactions, and then even how China has even reacted more recently with its stringent lockdowns. So if there are lessons to be learned from, say, COVID and the pandemic, what do you think the greatest lessons are? And I guess in terms of who's the arbiter of, who's the decider of what restrictions are reasonable to be imposed on individuals' freedoms? How do we decide? Is that in terms of a democracy? Is that where we're transferring that decision making to our leaders, and we're sort of abrogating our voice because we've said, okay, you guys are running the state, you're in charge now, you can decide. Do we lose some agency there? How do we reconcile the spectrum of responses, or is it a case of experience and education, and have we learned now what works, what didn't work? And in the event there is another pandemic, which eventually there will be, whether it's 50 years or 100 years or 200 years, it's just part of the cycle of life on this planet. Is this too much of a philosophical question in terms of?
No, not at all. I mean, I think you're dead right. There are lessons to be learned from something like this, because, of course, not only was it incredibly intense wherever one was, you, me, or anyone else, it was global. And so it really is an amazing example of how freedoms and responsibilities intersect, and across all nations, all geographies, all economies. For me, I think that it drew out some of the base principles upon which we exercise our freedoms within the governments the governmental or political systems that we exist in, within which we exist. So, for instance, I think the real telling restrictions on our freedoms during COVID were those that were accepted, even with a degree of begrudgingness, by the communities in which they were presented. So where they were imposed by force, by draconian lockdown, as was the case in PRC, for instance, there was huge resentment. I'm sure people who are watching this, and you yourself, remember those amazing photographs of people singing in lockdown out of the Shanghai towers, and trying to, as it were, encourage each other to continue with life. But that there's a cost in that. Maybe the Chinese government recognizes that. It's had a long history of authoritarianism, so it accepts the cost and knows it can quell it. In the West, and there were great varieties in the West as well, I think the most successful places were those in which people said, yeah, okay, we know we can't continue as we were, we can't travel as we were, we can't socialize as we were. And that came from a combination of strict rules, of policy urging, of persuasion, and I think, honestly, of the sort of exchanges it through social media. And, well, we weren't doing much face to face, but however, we were exchanging ideas with each other, saying, yes, we have to suck this up. You have to accept it. You've got to wear masks. And as we were all being educated as to what this meant, how dangerous was COVID or not, how quickly were vaccines being devised, and of course, as soon as we got to the point where vaccines were available, everything changed to a very substantial degree, and then we realized that it was just like any, really broadly, like any other disease that is controllable through vaccines. Um, so, the Rousseauian notion of the social contract, that we have given up some of our agency, as you said, but we do so expecting those to whom we've given up the agency will act in a way that is to our best interests, certainly not their own, and to our best interests. Now, there will be discussions about whether they've done so and whether my version of their acting in my best interest is the same as yours. And of course, those discussions occurred. And I think the West was successful in the sense that there was a great deal of freedom in expressing those opinions, some outlandish, some reasonable, some vacillating between the two. But the fact that we were able to ventilate our views, however strongly or however meekly that we put them, was, I think, a real exhibition of how governance, even though there were plenty of things that were wrong about it, governance can be a exchange of ideas flowing from the experts, the ordinary people, and those who govern us. And I think that, in many ways, it may seem odd, but it gave me a sense of, there is some hope about this. The ridiculous statements, power-hungry statements, utilizing the pandemic in a way that is just for political gain or personal gain, like, frankly, I have to say, is exactly what President Trump was doing, appealing to the sort of base instincts of those who would be anti-vaxxers and anti any idea that the state should have control over what people do. That sort of utilization, that exploitation, was criticized rightly for the chicanery that it was and that it is. And I'm not saying that was successful, because look how Trump is still managing to, I have to say, con half of the American electorate. But it was aired, and he aired his views, and the counter views were cutting in the way in which he was criticized. So, has it prepared us for the next pandemic? Well, I'm not sure about that. I suppose in economic terms, and this is an important point, it was incredible how the states were able to pump very quickly a lot of money into the hands of pharmaceuticals to devise something that we all wanted. I understand that. But when money is really needed, when everyone is being threatened, the rich as well as the poor, it's amazing how the state and those who control the state, private interests that control the state, can find the money. It's exactly the same with the GFC. After the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, trillions of dollars were pumped into the American, Chinese, and European economies. And yet they can barely come up with a tenth of that when it comes to international global aid. So, when the chips are down and those in power are facing real difficulties, then economically money can be found.
Yes. I think when where I was locked down, I think one of the disturbing things I found at the end of COVID was that during COVID, politically, the state was able to manifest solutions for the homeless. But as soon as the risks of COVID were starting to diminish, that was it. And the problem was just resurfaced, and it's like they're thrown back on the street again out of, hotels, and not great hotels. I guess what back in the day would have been boarding houses and other places where people would have been able to find shelter. And I thought that was, to your point, where the state has the power to find resources to problems, but then quickly reverts back to more of a political stance of, what's attractive to the electorate and what's not. But that's, I guess, that's a bit of an aside, but just a sort of interesting point you raised there. And in your book, you raise the question of the need for critical thinking in formulating responses to or understanding the tension between, and correct me if I'm right or wrong here, the tension between liberty and freedom. And there's a great need for more critical thinking. Am I correct? Is that how you touched it or in the book? And if I'm sort of correct.
Well, yes. Well, and in various contexts, perhaps one of the most obvious contexts in which I did raise it, and actually it's the critical thinking on the relationship between responsibility and freedom, liberty being the sort of the shell within which you find those two, was in respect of voice and freedom of expression. But it was in other areas as well, like with respect to security, and indeed with respect to trust and respect, which are two elements that I finished the book on, and of how we must both respect each other and our government. But that doesn't mean that in respecting them and trusting them that we can't be critics. In fact, that really goes to the heart of your point, that the voice that we use to make our governments accountable, as indeed also with our fellow citizens, that voice is something that we really must treasure, we must protect. Chris Hitchens has this great quote, which I use in the book, and I use in my students, in which he says that he would make a strong case to say that the most important right, freedom that we have is freedom of expression. Why? Because everything else depends on the capacity to be able to express your need for the rights to health, the rights to education, the rights to privacy, whatever. Now, one always adds a caveat to that, because, of course, Chris Hitchens was such an incredible intellect and such a superb user of the voice, and such a raconteur, that in many ways he could defend himself, could articulate, could analyze. Not everyone is in that same boat. But what he added to that was to say this, that one of the reasons why he's so adamant that there should be freedom of expression, and really limitations should be extremely restricted. There should be very few. Mostly the default should be freedom of expression, whatever you're saying, is that and this is what he says, he's never met anyone or never known anyone that he would trust as being the arbiter of what he can hear. He's never believed that there is any institution or any person that he would say, yeah, you can tell me what I can hear or not. And so he wants to hear it all, and he uses examples for him, anyhow, in any case, he says that I'm not happy, but I'm willing to allow voices for Holocaust deniers, despite the fact that he is himself Jewish. Why? Because he says, I want to hear them so that I can fight back, I can counter them, I can say, this is where you're wrong. Now, going back to the point that Hitchens is incredibly bright, was incredibly bright, incredibly articulate, he could do that. Maybe not everyone would agree with that, but for me, that, I think, shows how important it is within our own capacities to be given the chance to critique information or situations that come before us in life. And many of us will not do, most of us, nearly all of us will not be able to do it in anything like the degree that Chris Hitchens did. But we are nevertheless having opinions about what's in the news, or how we relate to our neighbors, or what happens at work, or what happens, walking down the street. And I think that is a very important right to protect. I do in the book, for me anyhow, say that I agree with limitations on speech when it can directly lead to hatred and violence. I think there have to be lines drawn. But insult, making fun, even deriding people because of whatever you would consider to be their characteristics, I'd have difficulty about drawing lines there, because you can argue back, and who is it that's going to make the silencing claim? And if you're going to say the government, well, fine, and if you're going to have an elected government, but elected governments don't always represent the views of the minority. In fact, very seldom do they. So I wouldn't be trusting them to protect minority views. Do we leave it to the loudest voice on the campus or on the street? Or those with the deepest pockets? Well, no, I'm not happy about either of those. So I think the default is, with those sort of outside boundaries set, to allow people to say what they want, to provide their own critique, however strange, odd, bizarre, wrong that might be. Let them speak. So therefore, for instance, just going back, because it's such a dominant feature of our current policy and will be increasingly this year, to the Trumpian United States and MAGA. I mean, a lot of that is just, well, it's just frankly bullshit. It's just to protect and promote what Donald Trump wants. But some of it is genuinely dangerous and genuinely inciting hatred that will lead and did lead to violence. That's where I think you can draw a line. It then goes to, and I know this is something you're also interested in, it then goes to, if lines are to be drawn, then who can and who should? Is it the state? Is it, for instance, social media platforms, the corporations that own them? And that itself is an awkward situation as well. As it were, allowing the censors to be our biggest corporations, sometimes populated or run by people that we may not like or agree with. These are difficult questions. I don't have easy answers, maybe processes by which to reach an answer, but they are ones that are going to plague us in the next decade, without doubt.
Yeah, I think I love your answer there, because it encapsulates so many different things. I think also, and it's like, especially you don't want this in an environment of the silence of dissent. We don't want that, because that's awful to have people being silenced for political reasons, whatever. And I think that some of that also comes back to, I think that I believe in the teaching and education of civil rights to young people, in terms of these because there's now an absence of, over the last 50 years, of, say, the church, which, for better or for worse, was a promulgator of standards in the community. And without that, you're basically left with, I guess, family, schools, and the state to try and fill that. And I don't know, I'm not going to even go there in terms of whether that's being done correctly or not. But also the need for the next generation to be able to think critically, to be able to determine whether a piece of information they're seeing is accurate, whether it's nonsense, whether it's false, is, to my mind, really super important now. Because if the state's not going to intervene and decide,
Yes.
or help, or just for its own reasons allow falsehoods to be perpetuated throughout the community because it serves their interests,
Yes.
then I think it's incumbent in the education system to teach young people the importance of civil rights responsibilities and the consequences of not fulfilling their duty of not engaging in hate speech and causing other people harm. And I don't think that's really I don't think that's well taught in our society these days. In other countries, it might be, it's probably done better than here. In other countries, it's probably worse. And that's why I was alluding to this concept of critical thinking. And I think there is some even evidence to suggest that the current generation, younger generation, through technology, is losing this capacity for critical thinking. Have you any views on that, or outside our scope?
It's interesting. No, my goodness, not. Absolutely not. I think your finger on the pulse there. Teachers have always been important, but no more so than today. This we're of the same age, I think, and you may actually remember something similar. But I remember one of my professors saying early on in my as a student, saying that the most important thing about education and what I can provide you, the professor, is not what to know, but where to find it.
Mm.
And he was the guide. It was a he guiding me or all of us to where you might locate this stuff. And inside that guidance, also equipping you with the capacity to be able to determine what was valuable and authoritative and rational and good thinking. Well, good is probably too opinionated a word, but that is
Mm.
useful, as opposed to stuff that is overly polemic, politicized, or whatever compromises its content, commercially profit driven. Um, Mind you, to try and understand which is which, you have to have you have to sort of read them all, as it were, or have a breadth of your input of information to your feed, as it were. Now, were in the days, we're talking 40 years ago, those in the days when, of course, we didn't have social media, we didn't have this enormous capacity to be able to access information that we can on the internet now. So the problem of where to find it and what to look for, and whether when we find it, if it's valuable or not, is now exponentially more difficult. And I think that our responsibility as teachers, whether it's primary, secondary, or tertiary, is to provide the tools by which to understand whether this is worthy of your attention or
Mm.
not. And to allow within that, of course, for differences of opinion. Some people will think, yes, that's absolutely where I want to go, and that's what I agree. I like that, maybe that polemic, or somebody who wants the opposite, or something in between. Um, and where I think this is becoming really uh, critical, a real sharp edge to this question, is right now. I mean, I know one is always thinking that the current issue in one's current time is the most important. But in terms of this issue of critical thinking and being able to identify what is worthy of your attention, um, the whole large language model movement in AI is incredibly influential. I
Mm.
mean, just last night, as I was coming back from university, I was listening to something on another podcast, wasn't yours, but another podcast, uh, about an author talking about the capacity for big, uh, large language models, LLMs, to just in the last few months to be able to provide you not only a gateway to whatever knowledge and whatever interests you have, so like a hyper version of um, um, our analogs that feed us our news feeds, but a sort of a broader version of that, not only to direct us, but also to give us the answer. So not just showing us where to go and find the answer, but these large language models, their capacity to learn what is out there, to filter it, and then give you the answer. Now, I don't know how close this is, but she was saying, she was at a conference recently in Silicon Valley in which this is what they were saying is happening right now with the new generations of ChatGPT and the other LLM models. And it struck me, just sort of reflecting on that then makes it even more difficult for you to have your own agency over what it is you think and what you think is the proper way to think, because you're going to be fed stuff that is based on perhaps your previous
Mm.
clicks and your previous interests. So I think finding a way to navigate that, and for us as the teachers, let alone passing that on to our charges, it's going to be a truly epoch-making challenge, and I'm not quite sure how it's going to pan out. I do believe in this sort of ingenuity of humankind to be able to find its way around what appear at first blush to be insurmountable problems, something that will, change the role of humanity on Earth. Um, we'll certainly be searching for it because I think a lot of people find that prospect of having, as it were, a machine learning uh, system of feeding you information, we find that abhorrent, or at least unpleasant. And therefore, you're looking for ways around it. You're looking for the authentic voice of the author. This particular person was actually a journalist, and she was talking about what it might do to their profession. That is, make them redundant, and it may make lawyers redundant if you can pump enough stuff in about the law. It may make academics or authors redundant or artists redundant. So I can't believe that will happen, at least not to the sort of apocalyptic level that I'm suggesting. So I think we'll find ways around. But what those ways are, what that ingenuity will be, it's just beyond me to say, I'm afraid.
Yes. I think, yeah, and I appreciate what you're saying, and I think I don't know enough about it yet. It's like this behemoth of issues. I'm perhaps on the sidelines and haven't sort of dived in to fully understand and grasp all the issues of where this is going. I guess all I know is that it's in its infancy, but it's moving at the speed of light. And I can see huge benefits in it in terms of freeing up individuals' times to do other things. But I think that the risks are very high. And hopefully the ingenuity of man, women, of humans will circumvent and overcome this sort of the risk that you've identified there. And I think that
and I think when you say that their risks are big, I think you're absolutely right. And I know, again, this is something you're interested in because I think the two main avenues of risk are, one, the profit motive, because people know that being able to capture somebody's attention or to understand what it is that they're thinking or what their likes are can be monetized.
Yes.
And that makes it incredibly attractive and massive amounts of effort and capital would be pumped into being the first in that line to shave off as much profit as possible. And the second is that, of course, those who want to know what we are doing before we even do it, surveillance, those who want control of their societies, and every government wants that to some extent. It's just that some want it to a total extent, totalitarianism, others to a lesser extent. That is the other area in which this sort of capacity to be able to feed and to be able to interact through electronic means with citizens is just nirvana. It's just such a marvelous tool that they cannot resist it. Now, those are two enormously powerful interests pursuing this, as you say, accelerating phenomenon. That means it will do nothing but accelerate continually until we find, or maybe not until we never will, but as we try and avoid it or get around it. It's a real juggernaut pushing through our society.
Yes. I've got to say there's great attraction to sort of moving off the grid and isolating oneself from the rest of the world as it catapults in a direction.
I've often thought that maybe I'm just getting old enough that soon I'll be, in a home or dead, so it doesn't matter. But I think, going to your point, actually, that's not going to be the case because we're talking about years, decade at the most, but probably just a couple. And I think it'll probably last that long, so I will have to face it.
Yeah. I just want to bring up something that came to mind, and I think it's this idea of critical thinking. And I was thinking back, being Australian, in the case of Australia, where we're talking about critical thinking, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but how society can latch on to a particular event or circumstance, and the media, everyone just goes crazy about it. And I'm talking about the Lindy Chamberlain case back in the 1980s, and of course, to me, that's just like, there are like probably 1,000 situations like that currently in the information sphere going on today, where there's this obsessiveness and there's bias and there's unjustified statements being made about things in terms of wars that are going on at the moment, where both, the rhetoric from both sides is just and the misinformation that's being generated, and people have to make a decision. And I think I see just a parallel, but now it's on steroids. So it's like there's this inherent sort of characteristic in human beings to latch onto these things, and they don't really care what the truth is, or they don't know what the truth is, or they think they know what the truth is. I don't know. It's just like, it's this thirst for, I might even call it drama, without any critical thinking.
But I think that maybe, and maybe I'm just clutching at straws here, Hugh, but I think that might be our salvation, in the sense that we want to be engaged in it. We want to know what the truth is, or we would like that our version of the truth will be substantiated, because our predilection is to go X direction or Y direction. But either way, the fact that we're engaged in it, we're engaged in the debate, we're looking at it, is, to me at least, a good sign.
Oh, yes.
Even if we're going in with and therefore you are engaged in it. Now, you would like to think that in that some people are also genuinely trying to find the truth, as
Yes.
it were, more than those who just want it to be, as it were, scandalous. And in that milieu, maybe it gets lost, but in that milieu, you're able to draw out those good features, those that are really, undercutting the crap and coming out with the kernel of good. And maybe I am being too idealistic about this, but I do think that is a sense or a sign of engagement that we want to encourage. Now, if it's only about the latest scandal in the news, but I think genuinely it's not. I think people, whether it is Israel and Gaza, whether it is COVID, whether it is Ukraine, whether it is the circus that is MAGA in the United States, people are engaged in it, and maybe that is a good sign. And with all this information, we can get stuff that we want to engage with, and so maybe that's the way out.
I take your point then. I think you've hit the nail on the head. It is better to be engaged than not engaged, and there's both. Yeah, thank you for that. You set me straight.
Oh no! So does that mean you're delaying? You're going off grid.
I'm
heading off
half
into
off
the
the
bush
grid now already. So, David, I think we're running out of time. So, thank you so much for this great talk today. It's been absolutely. I think the topic is, and the timeliness of this book you've written is so incredibly important for people to discuss the responsibilities that come with freedoms, and to reignite the concept of liberty. What's next for you now? Do you have another book in the pipeline that's, again, not in the academic framework?
Well, actually, I do. This one was, by the end of COVID, it had been written, and then, but COVID really got in the way of its publication, so it's only come out now. But but it's really been written for a while. And in fact, in the meantime, I had a year off to write this other book, which has been absolutely fascinating. A fascinating journey. It's the best way I could describe it, Hugh, is if you've ever seen Erin Brockovich, the movie. About
Many times.
Impossible odds. It is about another version of that. An English lawyer in his 60s now, but in his late 20s, early 30s, Indian, English, South African, brought in a case against one of the biggest asbestos mining companies in the world, which was British, for what they were digging, or the mining of asbestos and the milling of asbestos in South Africa, and how they continued to mine and mill for decades after it was abundantly clear, not only in the medical journals, but also to them themselves, through their own medics, that people were dying of asbestosis and mesothelioma. So it was a big negligence case. And people were told that because it was in South Africa and they were suing the British company in London, it wouldn't work. And it very nearly didn't. But after 6 years in the courts, it got to the House of Lords. He won. Then there was a settlement. Eventually, they got some money out of this big company. But it's an extraordinary story. Not just the legal side of it, which is actually in the background. It's the main story is how they put all this together. I went to South Africa and interviewed the medics and many of the survivors and their families. And also brought in the commentators at the time because it was happening. The case was happening just as South Africa was moving out of apartheid into its modern day democracy. So it had a huge implications for sort of white exploitation of black workers. It's been a fun ride, and it's based on hundreds of hours of interviews, just going through hundreds of thousands of documents. But the book is now finally written, and the manuscript is actually in with the publisher. So that's the next one. That's hopefully will be coming out in a year's time. But it was a lot of fun.
Great. Well, I hope we can have an opportunity to talk about that too. David, thank you so much for taking the time today to talk to us. I think your story and your text, The Liberty Paradox, is so fascinating and so timely. I think that people can probably get it on. Can they get it on Amazon?
Yes, you can. It's just it's
Everywhere.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's not in the shops here in Australia until next month, in a month's time from now. But it's everywhere online. You get in the usual places.
Great. Yeah. Well, I encourage everyone to read it. It's a great book to read and very timely and very enlightening from all perspectives. So, without further ado, David, thank you again so much, and I hope that we'll have the opportunity to speak again with you on a wide array of topics, because I think you've got so much great thoughts and insights to offer on what's going on in the world today. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Hugh. A real pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for what you said.
My pleasure. Thank you for joining us on the Indo-Pacific Dialogue. We hope today's discussion with David Kinley about his new book, The Liberty Paradox, has provided you with deeper insights and sparked your interest in that delicate balance between liberty and the responsibility we have with freedoms. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. You can follow our conversations on X, formerly Twitter, and on LinkedIn, and you can subscribe to future podcasts on your favourite platform. If you've enjoyed this podcast and would like to see further podcasts, you can become a sponsor of the Indo-Pacific Dialogue. Just contact us through our website. So remember, continue to think critically, engage actively, and stay connected with us for more thought-provoking episodes. Until next time, keep exploring the depths of the Indo-Pacific and beyond.